So you want to learn watercolor? You have come to the right place, my friend, because today we are going to be starting from ground zero, from the very, very beginning, the ABCs of watercolor. In today's video, we are going to be talking about supplies. This is a great video to watch to get a primer of what the different options are, what makes them different, why you would pick one over the other, the different papers, the paints, the different palettes, all this different jargon. And if you've ever been to an art store and you look around and there's like a gajillion options, this will be the video that helps to clarify what might be the best choices for you. So without further ado, are you ready? Let's paint. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the actual paints themselves. So with watercolors, when people are talking about watercolors, they're usually referring to paint either in a tube form or in pan form. And these are the two most popular formulations for watercolors. Tubes tend to stretch a lot longer and tend to be favored by people who are doing larger paintings, whereas pans are favored by anybody who's looking for something more convenient. The formulations are generally the same. I've spoken to quite a few manufacturers who will vouch that the tubes and the pan versions of their paints are identical. With that said, artists usually will prefer one over the other, and it's just a matter of figuring out what works best for your situation. Whether you're a very busy person, you don't want a lot of setup, say you do a lot of outdoor painting, on-the-go painting, this is the kind of situation that would work really well for you. If you're, let's say, a studio painter, somebody who does not do their painting on the go and who maybe needs a lot more volume or maybe also wants to be a bit more economical, then tubes can be a better option in that particular situation. Pans will be cheaper when you buy them individually, but they don't tend to last as long as tubes, and that's just because there's just not as much volume in these as there are in the tubes. Next, we'll talk about colors. But first, I want to talk to you about the sponsor of today's video, Craftsy. You all know that I've been honing my skills for over 20 years in the professional art world. But no matter how experienced we are, I feel that there's always something new to learn and to explore. That's why I love Craftsy, an incredible resource for anyone looking to expand their creative horizons. Craftsy is an online community where you can find over 2,000 classes in everything from knitting and cake decorating to woodworking, and yes, even drawing and painting. And it's not just about art. As a mom of two, I'm always mending holes, changing seams, and sewing back buttons on the clothes of my little ones. So having solid sewing skills is a lifesaver. Craftsy's Practical Sewing Tips and Techniques course has been a game changer. Instructor Nikki LaFoyle covers essential skills like adjusting tension, choosing the right elastics, and creating professional hems. And she also teaches how to insert different types of zippers, which is super helpful, attaching binding for a polished finish, and altering patterns to fit perfectly. And so Nikki's tips have made sewing so much easier and much more enjoyable and manageable. I'm even planning on making my kids a little handmade bunny out of an old suit jacket to flex on my new skills. Another one of my favorite things about Craftsy is the sense of community. You can connect with fellow makers, ask questions, share your projects, and stay inspired along the way. Plus, there's always something new to learn with their ever-growing library of classes. So if you're as passionate about learning new creative skills as I am, I would recommend checking out Craftsy. And guess what? The first 1,000 of you to click the link in the video description will get a full year of premium membership to Craftsy for only $1.49. That's less than a slice of pizza these days and way better for your health, I might add. So don't miss out on this awesome deal and join the Craftsy community today. All right, so let's get back to talking about colors. You don't need that many colors to get started. And if you are getting started, I actually recommend not buying a ton of colors because I think it's very important to know how to mix your own colors before you start adding all the extra colors. And it's kind of similar to the idea of juggling. So, you don't juggle with tiki torches and knives from the get-go. You start juggling with 2 balls. I know that because I kind of learned how to juggle in high school. You start by juggling with 2, and then eventually when you start getting that muscle memory, then they throw in that 3rd ball, and if you're really good, you can add that 4th ball. And then if you're really good at that, then you can start juggling with whatever it is you want, like, yeah, flamed tiki torches, knives, scissors. Let's keep this safe. But you know what I'm saying. So the same idea is true for colors, where you want to start with a very limited palette. And as you become more proficient with it, then you can start adding in all those extra colors. Watercolors also come in more novelty formats. Other formats that exist are watercolor inks. I think these are kind of a little bit of a misnomer. I don't believe that watercolor inks are really watercolors, personally speaking. I think inks are inks, watercolors are watercolors, but you will find brands like Dr. P.H. Martin's, Winsor & Newton, for example, have liquid watercolors like this that are called watercolor inks. These are quite difficult to work with, especially if you're starting out. They are not the same as your traditional watercolor experience. So I would say that for beginners, people who are getting started, if you're not familiar with the watercolor medium, then I would kind of steer clear of these because they do tend to be quite tricky. Another format, and we're just going to breeze over these because these are more unusual formats. Watercolors also come in watercolor pencil form. So these are kind of like colored pencils. You take your brush, you wet it, and it will disperse kind of like watercolors. A close cousin to that is watercolor pastels. These tend to be a lot more opaque, kind of like gouache, not to confuse you, but gouache is a close cousin to watercolors. It is basically like watercolors, except instead of being a very transparent medium, it is much more opaque. So it's going to be a lot bolder and not see-through like watercolor is. And that is going to be the same case for these pastels. So not to confuse you, but just to give you a broad overview of what is available out there, we're getting into kind of esoteric territory. When people are talking about watercolors, they're usually talking about this and this. In terms of brands, again, there is a huge range of brands out there on the market, all very distinct with their own personalities. And honestly, it's very hard to generalize, but I would say that only time and experience and trying all these different brands will help you understand what the different properties are between them. I will say, however, that even as a beginner watercolorist, I would always recommend you to start with an artist grade. Every brand has them, and usually it will say either artists or professional on the tube or on the pan or on the packaging on the website, wherever it is you shop. As it can be quite expensive, depending on also where you are geographically located, my recommendation to anyone would be to shop locally. And what I mean by locally is to go with a brand that is manufactured close to you. For example, if you are in Asia, there are a couple of brands that are terrific. Holbein is a great brand. It's made in Japan. Another great one is Mijello Mission, which is made in Korea. Those are two that I would highly recommend for Asia. Within Europe, there are brands that come to mind as well. If you're in the UK, Winsor & Newton is made locally. If you're in France, Sennelier. If you are in Eastern Europe, and actually all over Europe, Roman Schmal is a terrific brand. Very, very good value for what you are getting. And if you're in Germany, then there's Schminke, which is also an amazing brand. Those are sort of some broad ideas for Europe. Within North America and the Americas, my top recommendations for you would be Daniel Smith, which tends to be quite expensive, but in America, it is more competitively priced depending on whether or not you are able to buy it on sale, and M. Graham, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous brand. I paint nearly exclusively with M. Graham nowadays because it is just a gorgeous paint. We also have Core and Da Vinci, which are really solid brands that make great quality paints. And by no means are these the only brands available, because Australia has a brand that is made locally, which is called Art Spectrum. China has one, Russia has one, Ukraine has one. And since there are so many brands out there, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to link a document in the description below with a list of brands based on geographic proximity. So if you're in South America, or if you're in Africa, for example, where there aren't quite as many choices, then it may just be about finding something that's available and well priced for your geographical region. Now, for those of you who are asking me about handmade watercolors, here's my 2 cents. Handmade watercolors are tricky because they are kind of all over the map as far as the properties. Some of them re-wet very well, some of them are stiffer, some of them they're a little bit of a special beast. So I would not recommend starting out with a handmade watercolor if you are not proficient with the basics. In terms of what colors to buy if you are getting started, I would recommend what's known as a split primary palette. So if you look at a watercolor set of somebody like myself who's a professional, and you see like tons of different colors here, most of the colors that are on a larger palette with 48, I've seen even like 62 colors, a lot of them have what is known as convenience colors, which means colors that can easily be mixed, but that the artist would rather just take a shortcut on and not have to mix themselves. So what you really need, the basics, the pillars of your watercolor set will be what's known as a split primary palette. You basically want to have a primary color, primary meaning, the primary colors on the spectrum are yellow, blue, and red. And what a split primary palette is the primary colors, but with a warm bias and a cooler bias for each color. This might make your head spin, but essentially the theory is that as long as you have a cool and a warm version, so this is a cool version of yellow and this is a warm version of yellow. Warm because it is closer in proximity to the red side of the wheel, and this one is closer proximity to the blue side of the wheel. So we want to have a cool yellow and a warm yellow, a cool red and a warm red, and a cool blue and a warm blue. And in theory, as long as you have those 6 pillars, you will be able to mix every single color on the spectrum. So that is it for the paints. Now let's talk about brushes. We don't really need a lot when it comes to brushes. My recommendation would be to start with at least 1 round. And a round is exactly what it sounds like. It's a brush with a round tip. This is a really good all-purpose brush, which is great for most of what you'll be doing. And if you have room in your budget, I would go with 2 sizes. I would go with a big one and a small one. I would recommend a 10 and a 4, or an 8 and a 2. These are 2 essentials. And if you have a little bit of extra room in the budget, I would also add a flat brush like this, which will give you a bit more variation in the kind of marks that you make and allows you to paint really large areas really effortlessly. Brand-wise, there are 2 brands that I highly recommend, and they are Rosemary & Co. and Princeton. Both have excellent value for what you're paying for and are very, very well made. But if you don't find those where you shop, then I would just search for a synthetic brush that is made for watercolor painting. Not all synthetics are created equal, and manufacturers have gotten pretty clever about figuring out how to engineer brushes to suit many different types of mediums. So you've got synthetic brushes for oil paints, you've got synthetic brushes for acrylics. Watercolor synthetic brushes are specifically designed to hold on to water and to release it in a controlled way. So just double check before you buy and make sure that what you're actually buying is made for watercolor. And again, I'll have some brushes and all the materials linked below so that, if you're looking for exactly my recommendations, then you can find them very easily. Coming back to shapes again, because I know that a lot of people will go on Google or on, the shopping site of their choice and start looking at different brush shapes. And might even start wondering, like, Margot, why did you recommend rounds or squares? And, why didn't we start getting into angled brushes or quill brushes and all sorts of other brushes that exist? As you become more experienced and as you figure out what you want to paint, how big you want to paint, what your paint brand of choice is, like all these details, it will start becoming clear to you what you like painting with. And so starting really small and adding 1 brush at a time and building up your collection, I think is the best way to go about it in terms of buying purposefully, because you could buy a set of 8 and only use 2 out of those 8. And I think it's a tremendous waste of money, and just, I don't know, it's a waste. So I would recommend, again here, buying open stock, meaning buying individually, curating your collection of brushes so that you are choosing things based on what you need. So as we start to paint and we get into different subject matters and things, you might realize that, oh, I really wish I had a brush like this to help me with rose petals, which would be very different than if you were doing landscapes and you wanted like a really big brush like this for large washes and big ocean scenes. So it's kind of like cooking, some people need a whisk every day when they're cooking. And some people need wooden spoons, a lot of them. And some people need, the tongs, when they're stir frying or something. So it's like that. It's an instrument. Okay, I'm being thorough. I realize that I am very verbose. And sometimes in my videos, people tell me, you talk too much, Margot. But I really want to cover everything and tell you purposefully what everything is for and why you would pick one thing over the other. Because the last thing I want to do is be like, you need this and this is what you need, full stop, end of story. You need to know the whys and the hows and the nuances, because it's all about that. Next, we're going to talk about papers. And boy, do I have a lot to say about papers too. Are you ready? Okay, there are generally two families when it comes to papers. You have cold press and you have hot press. The general overarching difference between cold press and hot press is that cold press has a texture to it. When they press the paper, they don't heat the iron or the rollers, the thing that it takes to squash the paper. Hence, the paper will have a texture to it. It will have a tooth that makes it look very artsy, very beautiful, but it will also have more absorbency into it. Hot press paper, which is the opposite, has been pressed with a hot press, kind of like an iron. So if you imagine somebody with a hot iron, ironing your clothes, it's the same thing for paper. They use a roller that is heated, and that roller will squash and eliminate all the texture from the paper. The paper will not be as absorbent as the cold press is. Cold press paper tends to be a lot easier to handle for beginners, and it stays open longer. Open meaning that it won't dry as quickly. The downside to cold press paper is that the absorbency of it, the fact that it's kind of like a sponge, it pulls the moisture in, tends not to be as vibrant as hot press paper. That's number one. Number two is that because there's a surface texture, it's much less friendly if you're doing very intricate, detailed work. So for example, if you're doing traditional European style botanicals where you want to get in there very, very carefully with the details of the center of the flower and the seeds and the very intricate details, then that will be a lot harder to achieve on something that has a crinkly texture. Hot press paper, on the other hand, is extremely smooth, so beautiful for vibrant colors that really sit on top. They don't get pulled inside like the cold press. So the colors tend to be way, way more vibrant. It is also much more friendly for very intricate work. So again, if you're doing something really detailed, you're doing an eyeball and you have eyelashes and you want to have those each individual hair, then hot press paper will be able to deliver that super fine detail. The downside of hot press is that it is much more difficult to manage your water on. So you have to really have a much better understanding of water control on hot press than you do on cold press. Cold press, you can get away with a lot. Hot press paper, you have to know your stuff. That is why a lot of people on YouTube, they'll say, cold press is better than hot press. Cold press is not better than hot press. It's just different, and it is easier to work with if you don't, it's not as steep of a learning curve, if you will. In terms of the actual format, both hot press and cold press are available in different formats. They are available in pad format, pad like a pad paper, where sheets are like this. Very easy for beginners to get started on pad because, there's no learning curve. You don't have to do anything, and they are quite inexpensive. Arches is a terrific brand. I have a video about, not to plug too many videos, but I have a video all about different brands and some of my favorites as far as watercolor papers are concerned. So if you want specific recommendations, Arches is one. There's another one called Bao Hong. I will link a video in the description so that you can look more into that if you want to find it. But pad is the first one. Then we have the block. Blocks tend to be my favorite. So blocks differ from pads in that blocks are, they are sealed in on all sides except for, usually there's one little opening, like right here, there's a little opening here, but they are sealed together like this. And that is to prevent the paper from buckling. So if you are throwing a ton of water on there and you're getting really excited and you're painting and your paper's starting to do this warpy thing, which is what happens when you add moisture to something like paper, a block will keep it from doing a lot of buckling. Then we have loose sheets. Loose sheets usually are better if you are painting in bulk or larger pieces. So, yes, you will get a better price per square inch if you are buying large 32 by or 30 by 60 sheets, which are giant, really large sheets. Or like myself, I like to paint on very large sheets sometimes. But for most people, a block is a perfect place to start. I recommend something like a 9 by 12 gives you a nice area to work with. Don't get started on something this small, because when you start learning how to paint something like really small, then you get tight and it's really hard to let go once you learn how to paint tight. So having a little bit more extra room will give you the ability to flow. And we're not like gonna get crazy. It's just to allow the freedom and the ability to paint more with just your fingers. And I see a lot of beginners, a lot of people who just paint like they're writing a poem. And you a lot of times when I see somebody painting, you can really tell the level of experience by how they are laying down the marks on their page, whether they're using their whole forearm, their whole body to get the mark, as opposed to like right there. And I'm not disparaging anybody. It's just, so that you can start to think about these things and the reason and the rationale for why I'm saying these things. Because again, I like to give you my whole spiel, my whole story on all these things, because I think you deserve to know. Next up, we have palettes. So palettes, again, here we are met with a long laundry list of options. We have palettes like this, where you can actually have the pans within the palette and a mixing surface right here. These are great. If you want to get one of those, hey, power to you. Love it. But there are other options too. And if you don't have something like that, or you don't have that many paints, there are other options. This is a plastic palette. Small, portable, nice. Problem with plastic palettes is that you do have to prep them. Not enough people talk about this, but usually when a palette ships out, plastic palette specifically, there will be a coating on it by the manufacturer, which prevents it from getting damaged on its way to you. So there's a way of removing that. And the reason why you want to remove that is that if you don't, then the paint will not mix on it properly. It'll kind of bubble up and you won't be able to see your colors very well. And it makes it harder to mix. So if you decide to go for a plastic palette, then definitely check out a video. I'm plugging another video, my apologies, but there's so much to learn, so much to talk about. But there's a video on how to prep a plastic palette or a new palette, or even refurbish an older palette. If you have something, already in your possession that looks a little beat up, but you want to save, you can save it. And there's a great technique to do that. So yes, plastic palette. There are enamel palettes. This is a Whopper palette. I love this format, but the number of wells in here is just massively intimidating to a lot of people. If this doesn't scare you, this is awesome. Great. Not necessarily that great for traveling because it's so big. My favorite option is actually the most economical option, and that is to go to your local Goodwill, or even go to your pantry or wherever it is you keep dishes. Find your oldest dish that you never use, and never use it again once you paint on it, because for safety reasons. But ceramic or porcelain plates make the best mixing surfaces. And again, if you go to Goodwill or you go to your local thrift store, you can get these for $1 a plate. I think these were $2 a plate or something. And they make terrific mixing surface. You can see how well the paint adheres to it, which makes it such a joy to paint on. I would definitely recommend having a white one so you can see your colors, because if you have something that is blue or a funny color, then it'll be harder to see your colors. But it doesn't have to be a square. It can be a circle, it can be a flat dish, it can be a tray. Porcelain is a terrific option and the cheapest and unbeatable in my opinion. So if I didn't make it obvious enough by now, I definitely favor this over anything else. And the last couple of things to mention that most people will use at some point when they're painting is, one, your water receptacle. I like to use, and this is a Margotism, this is what I love doing because I have kids at home, but I also hear from people who have pets or cats at home and jump on the table. I have utility jars, which are basically, they look like jam jars, except they have a thicker base and they have a lid. And the lid is terrific for being able to step away really quickly, like I do. If I have to go pick up a kid or something, I always cover it before I move on, and that's to prevent any spills and also, any of my kids from reaching the contents of this, because some of the paints do have toxic or unhealthy pigments, so you really don't want your pets, if you have them, cats, dogs, whatever you own, drinking from your water receptacle. But basically anything you have will do. And I will always recommend recycling or upcycling anything you have. So if you have jam jars, mayonnaise jars, kimchi jars, whatever it is you have, you know, jars, specifically glass jars, are really, really great options, and you don't have to buy it. So definitely bonus points for that. I also had a viewer mention, you know, that she didn't want a glass jar. Use a peanut butter jar, use a plastic jar, so that if you do knock it over, it can roll around on the ground. You don't have to worry about the glass shattering. And then the last thing to mention are paper towels. We'll talk a little bit about that as it relates to water control and water management, but there is a lot of blotting going on. So paper towels, napkins, that kind of thing, or if you want to use old rags, that's fine too. Those definitely go a long way, and you definitely do want to use that. So that is pretty much it as it relates to the essentials and the reasoning for why we choose one over the other. I could go at length into detail about pretty much anything I spoke about today because there is so much to cover. So if you have any questions, let me know in the comments below if you need any clarification, or if there are things that that are bugging you that you want to know more about, because that's what I'm here for, folks. As always, thank you so much for watching and for joining me on these art videos, and I'll see you in the next one.